Dear Donna, we are so happy to have you here with us. We enjoy these few days with you a lot, and they will be unforgettable.
We'll see.
They are already. And your humor too is good. Dear friends, Donna Orange, educated in philosophy, clinical psychology, and psychoanalysis. Donna Orange teaches at NYU postdoc, New York University postdoctoral program in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, and in IPSS, Institute for the Psychoanalytic Study of Subjectivity, and in private study groups. She held the Freud Fulbright in Vienna in 2018, and is visiting professor of phenomenology at Duquesne University, fall 2019. You want to say the right?
I'll explain.
Duquesne. Okay. Recent books are Thinking for Clinicians, Philosophical Resources for Contemporary Psychoanalysis and the Humanistic Psychotherapists, and The Suffering Stranger, Hermeneutics for Everyday Clinical Practice, Nourishing the Inner Life of Clinicians and Humanitarians, The Ethical Turn in Psychoanalysis, and the last one that I know about, and you just finished writing your new book, so we didn't see it yet, but the last one is the Climate Justice, Psychoanalysis and Radical Ethics. Her next project concerns hearing the voices of those silenced by history, by culture, by ourselves. I will quote a phrase from your own lecture of today, where you say, "I often say that I belong to no psychoanalytic religion, but consider myself an interdisciplinary independent seeking to become a better human being." Dear Donna, we are so happy to have you here with us. And dear friends, this is a unique opportunity to encounter a clear and devoted thinker of our times and to learn directly from her about intersubjective perspectives. Please welcome Dr. Donna Orange.
Which one? The red one? That one is better. Okay. Thank you, Clowdia. Can you hear? Good. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Buzz. All of the introductions and welcomes are wonderful. They give me some courage that we will be able to do something useful together, not something that I ever take for granted. I also thank all of you, one, who are returning for the second day of this. It seems to me very surprising that half of you have already heard plenty from me, and you are here again. It's just amazing. And the other half of you are giving up your weekend, your Sunday, to be here, and I am really grateful. Oh, it is not? Well, whatever it is, you are. If it is not a weekend, then you are here at the end of a long work day, and that's even more amazing. You can see how much I do not know if I don't know that this is not a weekend. I didn't even know which place I was supposed to sit because I had no idea what my name was. So, if you do not understand something I am saying, please put up your hand and I will ask for someone to translate. I am very apologetic that I have no Hebrew. I couldn't prepare it before I got here to speak Hebrew. I know that you have it, but that I will be speaking between sometimes, and then you will lose me. And I don't want, I don't want anyone to struggle too much. Now, the second thing to tell you that the people I spoke with Friday already know is that I am completely deaf in my left ear. So that if you come and talk to me into this ear, I probably will not respond. And you may feel that I am not interested in you. And I don't want to hurt anyone, and I would be very sad about this. So please come around and talk into my good ear, which is perfectly capable. So that I would like to be able to acknowledge you and to hear you. What else? I was asked to speak to you today about varieties of self-psychology, and I must tell you right now that I don't know very much about self-psychology in Israel, or about the Buddhist versions of self-psychology that many of you know and live so profoundly. So please do not feel that I am dismissing what you do and what you love. I just don't know it very well. So I'm going to talk to you about the self-psychologies that I know and that I have encountered in the US and Canada. And I'm not going to talk about the ones I have learned about in Japan and in Europe, but if anybody has questions about those things later, you can ask me, because I have had some encounters with self-psychology, a lot in Europe and some in Japan and a little bit in Taiwan. So all of those I could talk about a little bit. It's actually quite wonderful to see a group of maybe 30 self-psychologists sitting in a basement conference in Taiwan, so thrilled to finally meet an American self-psychologist. They were like this. It was really an amazing thing in December. This is, let's see what else. I brought two handouts, and they were upstairs. One is the covers of my various books. For those of you who don't know my work, you're welcome to take one of those, either from the book table or the registration table. Those are the more recent books, so that you can find them if you're interested. And the other is a one-page article called Psychoanalysis in a Phenomenological Spirit. And of course, Heinz Kohut worked in a phenomenological spirit. So this is my connection back to the early Kohut, actually. But I wrote this a few years ago just as a personal statement about the kind of psychoanalysis that I always practiced and what it was for me. So if you want to know in a very brief way, not what theory I belong to or something, but what I mean by practicing phenomenologically, you can find that. And if they run out of them, I'm sure someone will make some more copies. Again, thank you for the beautiful introductions, all three of you, and for the work you all did to make this conference possible. And I know there are more people whom you named to whom I should also be thanking. My talk actually has three parts. The first is about the different varieties of self-psychology that I know about in the US and Canada. Very brief sort of outline of all that. The second is mostly about intersubjective systems theory, which is the variant that I worked on for many years. So I know the most about that one. And Gabby particularly asked me to talk more about that because she thought it was not well known here and that you would like to hear more about it. And the third is a set of reflections on my time at the Freud Museum. I was there for 5 months working in Freud's house last year. It was a great privilege, and it connected me back to the Vienna that both Heinz Kohut and Sigmund Freud lived in and loved up until 1938. So I will be talking with you a little bit about that. So there are 3 sections to this. Is it okay with you if I sit down? Yeah, thank you. My talk is entitled, Are All Voices Welcome? Pluralism in Contemporary Self-Psychology. Once upon a time in the 1970s, Father Heinz sat down in Chicago with a group of like-minded thinkers from Chicago and elsewhere to create a new psychoanalysis. They met repeatedly to get it just right, but the Father often did most of the talking. Or, in another telling of the creation story, he invented and wrote Self-Psychology by the Pacific Ocean in Carmel, California, where the Kohut family spent summers for many years. I have seen this place. As their son, for as many years as their son Tom can remember. From this beautiful town, you can see as much water as you can see from here in stunning Tel Aviv. Probably both stories are true, and further, it seems clear that both Heinz Kohut and the earliest group around him, of whom a few are still living, intended self-psychology to be psychoanalytic and to remain and be taught within the traditional structures, institutes, and organizations. It also seems clear that whatever Heinz's conscious intentions, I use his personal name both out of affection and to distinguish him from his son, who is a dear friend of mine, the effect was to create a self-psychology almost as dogmatic as the Freudian, instinct, Oedipal, and structural theories it was intended to replace or modify. At least in the 1980s, just after Heinz Kohut's death, when I was being taught self-psychology, there was only one self-psychology, and there was no doubt about its content. Mirroring and idealizing transferences, forms and transformations of narcissism, transmuting internalization, empathic listening, and above all, self-objects. You know all of this. This time was exciting. For me, it meant, and still means, the emergence of a humanistic psychoanalysis. Although Jay Greenberg and Stephen Mitchell, in their masterful and path-breaking object relations in psychoanalytic theory, found Kohut not relational enough, as orthodox relational psychoanalysts would later say of many of us, influenced by Kohut, they treated him with considerable respect as an innovator. Greenberg and Mitchell considered Heinz Kohut a mixed model theorist who retained allegiance to drive theory while developing a theory that contradicted it in the direction of fundamental relationality. They justly gave him credit for his contributions while challenging his inconsistencies and limitations. I believe their own perspective also limited their capacity at the time to value the vulnerability and dependency that later relationalists, including self-psychologists, have understood as central to the human condition. I would particularly like to say a word of respect and mourning for Louis Aaron at this moment, whom we have just lost. He was a very inclusive thinker who came truly to respect the vulnerability that the early relationalists did not value so much. But as always happens in psychoanalysis and other religions, divisions began. First away from organized psychoanalysis, and then also within the new movement. Self-psychology began to hold its own conferences, its own study groups. Later, despite the founder's preference, came institutes and a journal. We needed to feel we had something truly special to offer. Is this narcissism? I don't know. something that could not be crushed by the authoritarian structures of traditional psychoanalysis with the training analyst systems, the editorial exclusion, and so on. The mainstream, with more or less justification, tends to regard such breakaway groups as cultish, either to distract attention from its own authoritarianism or because the new group has developed authoritarian tendencies of its own. I think we have seen both, and it can be very difficult to sort out without a good dose of humility all around. For myself, coming from a family and a church that Dan Shaw might have described as malignantly narcissistic, I find myself allergic to anything that seems cultish, demanding unquestioning loyalty. I do not want followers, but I can fall too easily into being one. But more divisions arrive as soon as the founder, Freud or the so-called dissident, dies, especially when the group is still young. The internal struggles for power and succession allegedly arise around ideas, but who knows? I have heard some bloody stories and witnessed others. The upshot is that today we have several self-psychologies attempting to work together. I am not sure that I can describe them better than you could, but since you want me to try, I will with some trepidation and open to your corrections. First, of course, comes the Chicago group. We used to call them classical self-psychologists, or sometimes the orthodox. These writers and teachers, some students, colleagues, and patients of Heinz Kohut, believed, most of them are now departed or now think differently, that everything Heinz Kohut had said had the authority of Torah, and that nothing should be added or amended, only commented and interpreted. Attempts to suggest improvements in self-psychology were met with rage and tirades at the annual conferences and in smaller meetings. I remember a lot of this. I can bear witness to many instances. Thankfully, this time has passed. These ghosts have, for the most part, turned into beloved ancestors who taught us the best of what we learned to love in self-psychological psychoanalysis. Some of my generation carry traumatic memories, however, not only from our Freudian teachers, but from the more cultish of the classical self-psychologists. The closest inheritors of this one-person intrapsychic self-psychology today probably identify most with Dick Geist in Boston. The Chicago group today, people like Jill Gardner, Amy Eldridge, Brenda Solomon, Denise Davis, Carla Leone, seem very inclusive. In the U.S., the second position to emerge as a group were the phenomenological intersubjectivists, Robert Stollerow, who was a very much beloved younger colleague of Heinz Kohut and thus greatly resented by some of the older colleagues, and student of psychosis George Atwood, Bernard Brandschaft, and later I joined this group. We contributed together and separately to an intersubjective perspective indebted to self-psychology, but sometimes critical of it for specific language. In the early years, before the turn of the century, many believed they had to choose sides with or against the intersubjectivists. More recently, our phenomenological and contextualist presuppositions have infiltrated most self-psychological writings so that we are less frequently seen as a separate group. I am told that you would like to hear something about the intersubjective systems version of self-psychology, so I will give you a short summary. I hope you drank your coffee before you came. It will help you with this. I will give you a short summary, noting that many of these ideas, though not all, have been absorbed by most self-psychologists around the world today, though I do not know if this is true in Israel. So here we go. By intersubjectivity theory, we mean the psychoanalytic theory articulated in Structures of Subjectivity, Atwood and Stollerow, and developed in psychoanalytic treatment in contexts of being and in My Emotional Understanding in 1995. An early formulation of this viewpoint said, quote, psychoanalysis seeks to illuminate phenomena that emerge within a specific psychological field constituted by the intersection of two subjectivities, that of the patient and that of the analyst. I've often said that intersubjectivity is a meta-theory of psychoanalysis. It's a theory about the theories. It examines the field, two subjectivities in the system they create and from which they emerge in any form of psychoanalytic treatment. This is, what I mean by this is if you put a Kleinian psychoanalyst and a patient in the room, that's an intersubjective system, even if they don't believe in intersubjective systems theory. If you put a Winnicottian or a Freudian and a patient, this is a theory of what happens between the patient and the analyst, but it's also a theory about the whole system. Psychological treatment and pathogenesis are best conceptualized in terms of the specific intersubjective contexts that shape the developmental process and that facilitate or obstruct the child's negotiation of critical developmental tasks and successful passage through developmental phases. The observational focus is the evolving psychological field constituted by the interplay between the differently organized subjectivities of child and caretakers. Now that sounds quite abstract, but I would say in parentheses, think Winnicott. Okay? Intersubjectivity theory intends to describe the emergence and modification of subjectivity and defines these processes as irreducibly relational. We have sometimes described intersubjectivity as a systems theory with reference to its use of developmental systems thinkers like Beatrice Beebe, Frank Lachman, and Lou Sander. But intersubjectivity theory differs from the systems theory defined, for example, in family systems theories of Bowen and his collaborators. Intersubjectivity requires subjectivity, or rather two or more subjectivities, and retains its focus on the interplay between differently organized subjectivities, so that what the analyst brings into the process is equally important to what happens. And when we tell a clinical story as if the analyst is a neutral party, as if the analyst's history is not present in the conversation, for example, we're misrepresenting the situation. We're really not telling the story. The story has two sides that are interacting together. It's difficult to write clinical stories intersubjectively, but it's absolutely necessary. It's a fine art to learn how to write them. We cannot work within the intersubjective field and simultaneously step outside the field to describe it as family systems theorists attempt to do from a God's eye view. This impossibility may also account for what appears as psychoanalytic disinterest in empirical research. Positivist philosophers like Grunbaum and psychoanalysts like Spence find psychoanalysis unscientific, but they have misunderstood the essential nature of the intersubjective field. Even the best case studies can only feebly attempt to capture the feel of a particular intersubjective field or of an analytic couple. And I think that you know this if you are a clinician and you realize how different one clinical hour feels from the next one. The field is different. The intersubjective field is different in each one. We must examine the theories, prejudices, and assumptions that form our own subjectivity, but we can work psychoanalytically and understand psychoanalytically only from within the intersubjective field. For similar reasons, intersubjectivity theory differs from interpersonalism. This is like the folks at the William Allenson White, Harry Sachs Sullivan, and that tradition, which has been extremely important in New York and in the formation of relational psychoanalysis. The intersubjectivity theory concerns itself very little with interpersonalist concerns like who is doing what to whom, with gambits and control. What interpersonalists call participant observation requires, we believe, maintaining an external perspective that interferes with undergoing the situation, that's Hans-Georg Gadamer, with the patient. In our view, relational contexts are mutually constitutive. As students of aesthetics sometimes say, the writer creates the reader, and the reader brings the writer into being. This is kind of an important idea. The writer creates the reader, and the reader brings the writer into being. Intersubjectivity theory, though interested in the experience of interaction and agency, resembles more closely those currents in relational thinking that emphasize development and conversation between differently organized and inevitably subjective perspectives. On the other hand, intersubjectivity theory transcends the Freudian view of human beings. In classical theory, we are self-contained bundles of better or more poorly harnessed sexual and aggressive instincts, some directed at objects. Intersubjectivity theory sees humans as organizers of experience, as subjects. It views psychoanalysis as the dialogic attempt of two people together to understand one person's organization of emotional experience by making sense together of their intersubjectively configured experience. Although intersubjectivity theory is a recent arrival on the psychoanalytic scene, it really isn't now. Its roots appear in early phenomenology. Like Freud, Husserl studied with the philosopher Brentano, who unrelentingly emphasized the experience of the intentional subject. Unlike Freud, who at least intermittently embraced scientific empiricism, Husserl and later philosophers of subjectivity claimed that all experience is subjective experience. The original authors of psychoanalytic intersubjectivity theory, influenced as well by personology theory and by their own researches into the subjective origins of personality theories, recognized in Heinz Kohut's work the more radical perspective needed. Though he welcomed and promoted exchange between psychoanalysis and the other humanistic disciplines, Kohut insisted that the entire domain of psychoanalytic inquiry is subjective experience. He implicitly rejected drive theory along with metapsychological constructs generally. The only data for psychoanalytic understanding, Kohut insisted, are those that are accessible by introspection and empathy. Intersubjectivity theory does criticize particular aspects of self-psychological theory, such as concepts of transmuting internalization via optimal frustration and a pre-existing nuclear self. Nevertheless, it completely accepts self-psychology's most fundamental tenet, its definition of the sources of the sources of psychoanalytic understanding, as well as its conviction that self-experience is radically context-dependent, that is, rooted in specific contexts of relatedness. Now, in the early 1980s, Bernard Brandschaft came along. He brought to the collaboration extensive and intensive understanding of British relational theories. and began to make important contributions to the evolution of intersubjectivity theory. The phenomenological approach that emerged from the studies collected in Faces in a Cloud, with its thoroughgoing emphasis on the development and maintenance of the organization of experience, thus moved toward a fully intersubjective conception. In this view, all selfhood, including enduring patterns of personality and pathology, develops and is maintained within and is a function of the interplay between subjectivities. Conversely, the field itself consists of the relatedness between subjectivities. The people may be parent and child, siblings, analyst and patient, spouses, or other combinations. Intersubjectivity theory sees pathologies from phobias through psychoses in these terms. In other words, it radically refuses to place the origins or continuance of psychopathology solely within the patient. This is a big one. This point of view, therefore, differs with drive theory in all its variants. Because self-psychology and phenomenology have taught us to emphasize subjective experience, we also differ with interpersonalists who locate difficulties in living in the patient's desire for control, in repetitive enactments of earlier relational patterns, or in disavowal of responsibility. Instead, we study the intersubjective conditions or emotional contexts in which particular subjective configurations arise and are maintained. The principal components of subjectivity, in our view, are the organizing principles, whether rigid and automatic or reflective and flexible. These principles, often unconscious, are the emotional conclusions a person has drawn from lifelong experience of the emotional environment, especially the complex mutual connections with early caregivers. In other words, we're always organizing our experience, and we often organize it in really generalized and rigid ways. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. Until these principles become available for conscious reflection, and until new emotional experience leads a person to envision and expect new forms of emotional connection, these old inferences will thematize the sense of self. This sense of self includes convictions about the relational consequences of possible forms of being. A person may feel, for example, that any form of self-articulation or differentiation will invite ridicule, sarcasm, exclusion, or loss. Within this perspective, we have attempted to rethink such fundamental psychoanalytic ideas as the unconscious. The pre-reflective unconscious is the home of these organizing principles, or I like to call them emotional convictions, that operate automatically and out of awareness. They arise as emotional inferences that a child draws from his intersubjective experience in the family of origin. These principles may concern relatedness, as in, I must adapt to others' needs, moods, expectations, and so on, if I am to retain significant emotional ties. They may also consist in a fundamental sense of self, still intersubjectively configured. I will never amount to anything. I am always a burden. I am worthless and good for nothing. Those were my mother's nicknames for me. Worthless, go do the dishes. Good for nothing she used good for nothing instead of my name to call me. This is how one develops organizing principles, and they're so deeply embedded that you don't even know they're going on all the time. This is why we call them pre-reflectively unconscious. My parents called one of my sisters Mad Mary, and another one Terrible Teresa, and I was good for nothing. More often, these principles are emotional inferences drawn as the child attempts to organize some sense of self out of chaotic, traumatic, or more subtly confusing early and later relational experience. We have also described a dynamic unconscious. This is the closest one to the Freudian unconscious. This consists of emotional information once consciously known that had to be sequestered or forgotten or hidden away because it created conflict for the subject. In particular, the memory would threaten the tie to caregivers on whom the child needed to depend. This form of unconsciousness is dynamic, as in Freudian theory, because the effects of such early experience, unavailable for reflection, continue to appear as repetitive troubles in an adult's life. Memories of parental cruelty that conflict with needed idealizations are obvious examples. This unconsciousness, unfortunately but inevitably, is also created and maintained in an analysis because awareness may be limited by what the analyst can know and tolerate. Now, all of you who are working clinicians have a pile of examples for this. Finally, the unvalidated, the third kind of unconsciousness, describes those aspects of subjective life that could never fully become experienced because they never found a validating response in the emotional environment. This is the one that's the closest to the cohesion mirroring idea. Often aspects of one's talents and interests, one's character, as well as of the crises and quandaries of one's emotional life, have never found the recognition they needed to become fully real for the person. An intersubjective understanding of the psychopathology and of unconsciousness has important consequences for psychoanalytic practice. Psychoanalysis will consist in the mutual creation of an emotional environment, an intersubjective field, in which it is safe to explore together those regions of unconsciousness that make up the problematic aspects of subjectivity. The interplay of transference and countertransference, the organizing activity of both patient and analyst within the analytic experience, makes up the intersubjective field of the analysis. The joint effort to understand both past and present organizing activity as a function of the experience of particular intersubjective fields means that past and present are always dialogically involved, implicitly at least, with those who cannot even try to understand the past and have no access at all to it. Explicit dialogue between past and present may be many years ahead. The intersubjective field of the analysis, made possible by the emotional availability, that goes way back into my earliest work, of both analyst and patient, becomes a developmental second chance for the patient. New, more flexible organizing principles can emerge, now accessible to reflection. Maybe I'm not always good for nothing, only most of the time. Maybe I can absorb a little bit of appreciation from you that could modify this rigid and deep and profound organizing principle that I still at age 75 carry around with me. New, more flexible organizing principles can emerge, now accessible to reflection, so that the patient's experiential repertoire becomes enlarged, enriched, and more complex. Under severe stress, old organizations of experience may return, but now a person can recognize them and relativize them. Oh, there's that old demon again. And by reference to their origins in past relational experience. In our view, there is no distinct body of clinical theory or of technical recommendations to be derived from intersubjectivity theory. That doesn't mean we don't have a clinical spirit. I'll tell you more about that. Rather, the intersubjective perspective introduces a more general characterization of all psychoanalytic work from within any specific clinical theory, because each treatment includes an analyst with a point of view. Different kinds of intersubjective fields develop in classical, interpersonal, or self-psychological treatments, as well as in each psychoanalytic pair. From a clinical point of view, intersubjectivity is not so much a theory as a sensibility. It is an attitude of continuing sensitivity to the inescapable interplay of observer and observed. It assumes that instead of entering and immersing ourselves in the experience of another, we join the other in the intersubjective space. Each participant in the psychoanalytic field brings an organized and organizing emotional history to the process. This means that although the analysis is always for the patient, the emotional history and psychological organization of patient and analyst are equally important to the understanding of any clinical exchange. What we inquire about, or interpret, or leave alone depends on who we are. The analytic process, as relational theorist Lou Aaron has explained, is mutually constituted but asymmetrical in the responsibility sense. One participant is primarily there as helper, healer, and inquirer. The other chiefly seeks relief from emotional suffering. The Latin root of patient means to suffer, to undergo, or to bear. The word may also be related to the Greek pathos. In the developmental process we call psychoanalysis, one is primarily guide, and the other seeks to organize and reorganize experience in less painful and more creative ways. Nevertheless, each is a full participant and contributor to the process that emerges. There are, however, attitudes that characterize our clinical work, chiefly three. One is a focus on these emotional convictions or organizing principles that pattern a person's experiential world. We're looking for those things. Two is something that George Atwood calls radical engagement. Now, what is that? That is a self-reflective awareness of the clinician's constant and unavoidable participation. I'm just not sitting back there watching you. And three, a refusal to argue about reality. That is, to assume an authoritarian, knowing attitude. We have already discussed the emotional convictions that intersubjectivity theory calls organizing principles. The identification and working through of these emotional organizing principles is the daily bread of ordinary clinical work. Although much of the childhood experience may be easily remembered, the full power of the shaming conviction that one is defective, the village idiot, comes to conscious awareness in dialogue with an analyst or a therapist who can hear and respond. And there's some things we just don't know until we're there. For example, I remember, this may seem like a very small thing, but my analyst would ask me sometimes whether the room was warm enough or cool enough for me. And I would often say, I don't know. And it wasn't until, she was astonished. It wasn't until we really processed her astonishment about that I began to realize how out of touch I had been with my own, not just physical, but just my own sense of anything being okay or not okay for me my whole life. There are aspects of one's own being that only come out in a clinical setting where somebody's actually paying that kind of attention. I wasn't used to anybody taking any interest in whether I was warm enough or not, or cool enough or not. I didn't know what to make of such a question. This seems like a very small example, but this is something that wouldn't be strange to those of you who've been working in clinical practice. I would have been a tough patient for you. Such a therapist's very interest in the relational origins of such emotional convictions tends to call them into question and to open the possibility of experiencing oneself in other ways. By radical engagement, we mean the self-reflexive awareness of our own implication in what we come to understand with the patient. Our own emotional history, clinical theories, gender, sexual orientation, forms of embeddedness in larger cultural contexts, race, religion, all of these things, and attitudes toward difference will be present throughout the intersubjective system that we form with the patient. Further, our very choice of psychoanalytic theory will be shaped by these same factors. Most necessary to a radical engagement in the intersubjective field, however, is the therapist or analyst's willingness to know and acknowledge deeply ingrained bias. It took me many years to understand how racist I was, for example, and what that was doing in some of my clinical work. This leads both to the receptive clinical attitude that in more recent years I have called the hermeneutics of trust, as well as to the ethical turn I'm going to note in passing later. A third aspect of intersubjective clinical work concerns our attitude toward reality, and talking about this usually gets me into hot water in some places. Understanding that each of us has only a limited perspective, giving only a partial access to truth, requires us to engage with the patient in a search for what I like to call emotional understanding. In Hans-Georg Gadamer's words, the person with understanding does not know and judge as one who stands apart and unaffected, but rather as one united with a specific bond with the other. He thinks with the other and undergoes the situation with him. We understand by undergoing with the other. We attempt through conversation and dialogue to make sense together of the experiential world, whether of trauma, exclusion, discrimination, or any other relational experience of this patient, and to find how past experience is organizing the expectancies for future experience. It requires an analyst who can suspend interest in the facts without denying the patient's perspective and attend to emotional meanings to create with the patient a system that supports understanding, respect, and further personal development. What is needed is an ability to suspend attachment to the analyst or therapist's perspective, both personal and theoretical, as automatically or at least somehow superior and privileged, in favor of the kind of listening that might inform us of something. This is a discipline at least as rigorous and demanding as the abstinence and neutrality of former years. It is not anti-realistic or constructivist in the more radical sense, but rather requires us to acknowledge the reality of worlds of experience that differ from our own. Intersubjectivity theory simply reminds us that we have no privileged access to reality. And that's really important when we want to say that the patient is talking crazy. It gives up the search for certainty, including diagnosis and other timelessly demarcated categories, in favor of the search for understanding. So there you have a summary of intersubjective contextualism. It lives in the self-psychological big tent without formally calling itself self-psychology, but rather a kind of psychoanalytic phenomenology. We attend the self-psychology conferences. We used to do it with lots of disputation, and now it's not at all. So you can see that we've just sort of woven into the conversation. As for self-psychology as taught and practiced in Israel, I must plead considerable ignorance. I suspect you are of more than one mind about many things, and I'm very interested to hear. Meanwhile, there are two more international trends to note. As an increasingly large group concerns itself with cultural history and social justice. We might say they have enlarged the concept of the self-object milieu to take emergencies in racial, sexual, economic, and climate injustice as essential to our work. Whether this should be considered another self-psychology is hard to say yet. The IAPSP members in this group tend to contribute to the multidisciplinary Cambridge and Boston conference held every 2 years and called Psychology and the Other. Most of my energy goes there in recent years. Probably the largest trend of the past 10 years might be called relational self-psychology. Not only do we find the same people presenting at IARP, the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, and IAPSP, the self-psychology group, we find them saying almost the same things in both places. Some of us are explaining to relational psychoanalysts that self-psychology is a variant of relational psychoanalysis and exactly what it contributes. Shelley Doctors is especially good at this. Others explain to self-psychologists what we can learn from relational psychoanalysis. Many of us now refuse to categorize ourselves. I often say that I belong to no psychoanalytic religion, as Gabby quoted me, but consider myself an interdisciplinary independent, seeking to become a better human being. This brings me to by the way, I adored the quotation that I had forgotten that I ever wrote that. Thank you for that, Buzz. This brings me to my main concern about groups of self-psychologists or of any kind of believer. Allegiance to a leader or to a set of beliefs is simply dangerous, characteristic of cults and ideologies, not of mature groups of creative human beings who have learned to support each other. Some leaders have a particular gift for encouraging the independent thinking of the people around them. Stephen Mitchell and Lewis Aaron were imperfect examples. We might say they created self-object experience whether they liked the idea or not. Then they couldn't help it. Then when we lost them prematurely, a choice emerged from the morning. We could close in on some dogma we believe they would have wanted, or we might keep expanding the circles of creativity. A lot of closing down came after Stephen Mitchell's death. But I don't think that's going to happen after Lou Aaron's death. We just lost him. I think that there's more. I think we're absorbing his loss in a different way, and it's partly because of the way he did. For one thing, we knew his death was coming, and he prepared people for it. Steve Mitchell just was gone like that. Outstanding women in self-psychology have become such generative leaders. Anna Ornstein, Marian Tolpin, Estelle Shane, to name a few. Each of these three belonged to the early circles around Heinz Kohut, but each developed the capacity to think for herself and to support this capacity in the many younger women and men we see in self-psychology today. They have embodied the best of what Heinz Kohut taught us about creative and courageous leadership. Not one of them, to my knowledge, has developed a cult following, what we call in the States groupies. I wish to honor them and to thank them for being my teachers. Both Sigmund Freud and Heinz Kohut, on the other hand, grew up in Jewish Vienna, in whose shadows I spent half of last year. Both fled after the Anschluss, and we can understand the style of both in the context of dangerous anti-Semitism. From the beginning, the circle around Freud took on a religious tone, even while it continued to examine from various angles the psychological motivations for religious belief, culminating in the future of an illusion. Max Groff, the father of little Hans, and member of the early Wednesday group, describes the atmosphere there. When I read this, it was just astonishing. He writes, I have compared the gatherings in Freud's home with the founding of a religion. However, after the first dreamy period and the unquestioning faith of the first group of apostles, the time came when the church was founded. Freud began to organize his church with great energy. He was serious and strict in the demands he made of his pupils. He permitted no deviations from his orthodox teaching. Subjectively, Freud was of course right, for that which he worked out with so much energy and sequence, and which was as yet to be defended against the opposition of the world, could not be rendered inept by hesitations, weakening, and tasteless ornamentations. Good-hearted and considerate though he was in private life, Freud was hard and relentless in the presentation of his ideas. When the question of his science came up, he would break with his most intimate and reliable friends. If we do consider him as the founder of a religion, we may think of him as a Moses full of wrath and unmoved by prayers, a Moses like the one Michelangelo brought to life out of stone, to be seen in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome. After a trip to Italy, Freud never tired of talking to us about this statue. The memory of it he kept for his last book. In the meantime, Freud's theories spread all over the world. Inspired adherents appeared everywhere. New pupils, new apostles. One day Freud brought into our circle a tall, good-looking physician from Switzerland. Freud spoke of him with great warmth. It was Professor Jung from Zurich. Another time he introduced a gentleman from Budapest, Dr. Ferenczi. Branches of the Freudian church were founded in all parts of the world. Of course, we know what happened to these two. And I tell in my new book the story of the very first time Freud said to his group, "This is not psychoanalysis," where he began to put the boundaries down, and if you were outside, you were outside. You could say he built a wall. Even Freud's family knew that he was a dominant personality. When I came to the museum, there was a saying written in German up on the wall, and I was able to read it, but I translated it, but I asked for some specifics about where this came from, and this was by Freud's grandson, who was often in the house. He was one of the children who was playing out in the garden, and I used to work in this little veranda at the end of the library, for those of you who have been there, that overlooks the garden. And Freud used to watch his children and grandchildren play out there. I mean, it was such a privilege to be in this place. I can't tell you what a privilege it was to be and work in this place. But there was on the wall, these words were written. Ordinary emperors and kings have only one court. Grandfather had two. The first court was the psychoanalytic one. The second court belonged to grandfather's private life. You do not have to be Galileo to notice that this one revolved around grandfather too. and they had the table set up with everybody's place marked, where the different family members always sat, and of course Freud was at the head of the table. My earlier and surely incomplete reading of Freud's authoritarian style attributed his tendency to exclude, shun, and silence dissenters to his intense desire to be regarded among the greatest of Western groundbreakers with Copernicus and Darwin. Complexifying the clear theories of infantile sexuality, the Oedipus and the drives, not to mention diluting the pure gold of analytic practice with the copper of suggestion, could not be tolerated. The great Moses might become a forgotten nobody. But living and working in Freud's Vienna, including several months in the unrenovated veranda of his house, from which he watched his children play in the garden, has taught me something else. We later psychoanalysts know and do not know that more or less 200,000 Jews lived within walking distance of Freud's house. I do not exaggerate, in 1900. We do and do not know that all of them were gone by, I say here by the end of 1938, actually by the middle of 1939. Freud and his immediate family escaped to London, but despite his efforts to get visas for them, his four sisters met a fate described in detail by my friend Pam Cooper-White. She quotes a Treblinka survivor who testified that one, either Marie, age 81, or Polly, age 78, approached the camp commander, showing him an identifying document, saying she was the sister of Sigmund Freud, and asking to be given light office work. The commander said there must have been a mistake and told her that in 2 hours there should be a train to Vienna. She could leave all her valuables and documents here, have a bath, and after the bath she would receive her documents and a travel permit to Vienna. She went to the bathhouse from which she never returned. Cooper-White also lists the names and fates of the 11 Jewish members of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Most had already gone. Itself disappeared from the IPA before the end of 1938, who were unable to emigrate after the Anschluss. The end came swiftly in Vienna. The streets near Freud's house are lined with Stolpersteine, remembering the names and death camps of those who used to live in the houses, often with a note that there were 57 others, or that in this house 110 were gathered to wait for transport. One lives in a spectacularly beautiful crime scene with a determined veneer of normality. I am informed by local psychoanalysts that only 2, possibly 3 Jewish psychoanalysts live and practice in Vienna today. When I told them my own experience of psychoanalysis had been primarily and extensively among Jewish colleagues and patients, they seemed mildly surprised. Where did these people come from? They wondered. But the clouds had long been threatening. Not only did Vienna, long a haven for Eastern European Jews, including Freud's parents, elect a rabidly anti-Semitic mayor in 1897, sorry about the number, from whom Emperor Franz Joseph could no longer protect his city. In addition, the very success of Jewish leaders in business, in the arts, in the intellectual life of the Wiener Moderne or the Jung Wien encouraged a deadly envy, harking back to the worst medieval stereotypes. And this was only the secular form of hatred. The Catholic Church, deeply ingrained in Austrian life even to this day, no shopping on Sunday even now, also nurtured the deep roots of anti-Jewish hatred, dating before anyone's memory. Here is an example, probably known to both Freud and Hitler. Years ago, when I was studying Heidegger in order to teach his early work, I learned of his Catholic background and influenced by the popular Austrian preacher Abraham of Sancta Clara. He was a rabid anti-Semite, proclaiming, "After Satan, Christians have no greater enemies than the Jews. They pray many times each day that God may destroy us through pestilence, famine, and war. Aye, that all beings and creatures may rise up with them against the Christians." Robert Michael, author of The History of Catholic Anti-Semitism, The Dark Side of the Catholic Church. That's my tradition, so I'm very ashamed. Believes that Mayor Karl Lueger found in Sancta Clara the most important impetus for his anti-Semitism. It was shocking, walking around in the 1st District last year, to find a street named after Santa Clara, then a statue of him in the Volksgarten near the Albertina and Staatsoper, and later a plaque honoring him in a church whose name I cannot remember. So when we find in Cooper White that anti-Semitism shaped the early history of psychoanalysis, we recognize something. It is still in the air there, unheimlich, uncanny as Freud would say, and unconscious like the air we breathe, not knowing it is poisonous. If we do not seem Jewish, it comes out. On a warm evening, my husband and I visited one of the charming Heuriger, the new wine gardens, not far up on the Strassenbahn. When we paid our bill, the friendly waiter, eager to show off his English, told us he had learned it working in the U.S., but he returned to Austria because he couldn't bear working for poor wages for a Jew. He expected us to understand and agree. It all happened so fast that we scarcely believed we had heard him and he was gone. So Freud's authoritarian style now takes on additional meaning for me, that of a paterfamilias absolutely determined to protect his own and never to give in to those who would dilute his discoveries or leave us weak and vulnerable, whether to the anti-Semites, to the medical profession wanting to exclude lay analysts, or to other thinkers with strong alternative theories like Adler. We may regret the losses Freud's doctrinaire style produced, but the context perhaps makes his style more forgivable. And I want to say a little bit that it's kind of like that with Heinz Kohut too. His style was pretty authoritarian too, and he too comes from that context. We know much less about Heinz Kohut's emigration story, but I would guess that it links to his dominating style too, and that one day we will know more. Unfortunately, when leaders need to be the center of what goes on around them, no matter why they have this need, they reduce their followers to disciples, as both Freud and Kohut did. I believe for the sake of the humanistic legacy that Heinz Kohut left us, we need to do better. A pluralistic, inclusive self-psychology in dialogue with other disciplines, other psychotherapies, and other humanistic forms of psychoanalysis will be faithful to this legacy. Some years ago, I tried to formulate some aspects of this humanistic and ethical voice. Without minimizing or disparaging the contributions of other traditions, here is my own reformulation of those contributions that Greenberg and Mitchell saw from Kohut so long ago. Self-psychology has helped to restore a humanitarian voice to psychoanalysis, loudly protesting the treatment of human beings as specimens and diagnoses. Self-psychology in all its variations has affirmed relatedness and interdependence as the basic human condition. Self-psychology has attempted to remain experience near in its theorizing and practice. Self-psychology has legitimized care, compassion, and even tenderness in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Self-psychology, with its awareness of the many forms of shame and degradation, has placed the restoration of human dignity in the center of the therapeutic project. These contributions have been shared with many other forms of relational psychoanalysis and do not begin to enumerate what we have learned from them. Thank you.
Donna, thank you so much for such an amazing lecture, so enlightening, so systematic, and we learned a lot. So still we can say that this weekend will be unforgettable, and you are so good for so many things, as we noticed. Dear friends, we will shorten our break because so we will be meeting again at 6:25 minutes. 6:25 דקות, אנא תהיו באולם. תודה רבה.
Okay, now we have a break till 6:35.